Welcome back to this series of lectures on deaf children's literacy. We're halfway through now, so I just want to recap on what we've looked at so far. I've talked about a model of learning to read, which has highlighted two kinds of skills, phonological skills and language skills, as being really important for reading in hearing children. And I've shown that for deaf children, reading is similar in some ways, but it's also different because for many deaf children, language is a particular issue. And so for hearing children, supporting phonological skills, if they need supporting at all, is usually all that you need to do to help children learn to read. But for deaf children, we really need most of the time to be thinking about not only phonological skills, but also language. And I've suggested in a previous lecture that speech reading skills might be particularly important in relation to the way that deaf children learn to read. And this is the topic of this lecture. I want to talk about speech reading, what speech reading is, and think a little bit about why it might be important. So as usual, we've got some learning objectives, and I want to talk about the multimodal nature of speech and speech perception, think about why speech reading might be particularly important for deaf children, how we might assess it, and then right at the end I want to ask whether we can actually train speech reading skills. Now here's a chance to show you a rather beautiful photograph of a baby before birth. And the point of that is, of course, lots of research now has shown that for hearing babies, actually they're learning a lot about the world before they're born, because they can actually hear pretty well and they can even learn something about language before they're born. Now, although obviously the position's going to be rather different for children with a significant hearing loss, they're going to hear much less. There's something in common between deaf and hearing babies, which of course is after birth, they've suddenly got the visual world as well as the auditory one. Because before birth there isn't really much to see, and I suspect that's one reason why the development of vision isn't complete at birth and it continues to develop after birth. Hearing's up and running well before birth, so you need to be able to hear before you're born, but you don't need to be able to see. Once babies are born, suddenly they have the opportunity to integrate what they're hearing with what they're seeing. And we know that babies can actually recognise familiar sounds when they're born. They can even tell the differences between languages. But babies are also very, very interested in the links between faces and voices. In fact, if you've got any experience of young babies, you know just how much they look at faces, how much they particularly look at faces when people are smiling and talking to them. They are particularly interested in this link between what somebody's saying and what's going on in their face. And there's a very famous study that was done by Kuhl and Meltzoff quite a while ago now, but again, lots of other studies have found essentially the same, which is they gave young babies, 4 months old, video recorded faces. And the faces, they weren't saying anything very interesting, but these stimuli were very carefully chosen, because one face was saying "eh" and the other face was saying "ah." Then babies heard either "eh" or "ah", and what the researchers did was then looked to see which face did the baby look at most. It was very clear. Babies knew which face went with which sound. So we know that actually what's called cross-modal integration, linking sounds and vision, is there right from birth. And actually there's lots of integration. I mean, babies can actually link vision, for example, with how they feel something in their mouth. And a huge amount of what we do as humans actually right through our lives is integration across modalities. And there are some interesting studies that show this by using brain imaging techniques. And here's a study that I think is really quite thought-provoking, because in this study what happened was that people who were in a scanner either listened to words being spoken, or they saw a video of somebody saying the same words but with no sound. And what was really interesting was that there was a big overlap in the area of the brain that was active in listening to the word and actually seeing the same word being spoken with no sound. But because both of these activated the primary auditory cortex and also the auditory association cortex. So in other words, these are the bits of the brain that are particularly specialised for dealing with speech. So we've got lots of evidence both from babies and from studies of imaging in adults that our brains are really geared up for doing cross-modal integration. And this is really where the idea of speech reading comes from, because speech reading is accessing information about speech from the movement of the lips and the parts of the face that also move when you're talking. And you almost certainly know the term lip reading, but researchers have tended to prefer the term speech reading because what it's capturing is that we're talking about all the information that you can get about spoken language, and it isn't just from the lips, as you know. Why might speech reading be particularly important for children who are deaf? The idea for this was mooted particularly by Ruth Campbell, who's done some very good reviews on this topic, one of which I've listed right at the end of this lecture. And she's always been one of the people who's said that speech reading might be particularly important for supplementing the information that deaf children are getting about the sound of spoken language. But the original evidence about the way that the visual component of speech interacts with the auditory component comes from something that's called the McGurk effect. Now, like many things, the McGurk effect came about by accident, because the researchers and Harry McGurk, who I had the privilege of knowing, who was a developmental psychologist, he was actually preparing some dubbed videos of some speech sounds. And when they were producing these, they thought they'd somehow got the wrong bit of dubbing onto the videos. So let me just show you an example of the McGurk effect.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
Now, I'm going to play you this again, and this time I want you to close your eyes.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
Okay, now, not everybody gets this effect, but for most people, what you hear with your eyes closed is ba, but what you perceive when you're actually looking at the video clip is fa. Unfortunately, I can't tell what you heard when you saw the movie, but the reason that you get that effect is that when you can see the sound that somebody's producing, that actually affects the way that you hear it. So that's very good evidence, I think, that the visual component of speech is really important for perceiving speech. But of course the McGurk effect, as I said, came about by accident, and it came about from looking at single phonemes that were actually artificially produced. So since then, other people have gone on and actually looked at what happens when you have natural speech rather than this rather strange, especially created, dubbed audiovisual speech, and real speech rather than single phonemes. And actually what you find is that you can actually perceive speech better when you can actually see it as well as hear it. This is particularly the case when what you're actually trying to process is something that's much more difficult to understand. I think another good example of this is that when you're not so familiar with a foreign language, and in my case that's French, it's much harder for me to really understand French properly when I'm trying to talk to somebody on the telephone. In fact, I'm really glad for the internet now because I very seldom need to do that. So we've seen then that the visual component of speech improves comprehension, and we can see that in a variety of studies, and it seems to be important right from birth. So the idea is then that if this is important for people who can hear really well, it's going to be particularly important if you can't hear so well and if you've got limited access to the auditory component of speech. But of course there's a difference between using visual information to help you understand speech when you can already talk and you know a language really well, using that information to help you acquire language. And of course that is what would be the case with deaf children. So let's have a look at some of the evidence about speech reading and deaf children. And if we look at children with cochlear implants, we find that actually their speech reading skills tend to be better when their implants delayed. So the idea is then that if you rely more and for a longer period on the visual component of speech, you will actually make greater use of it. And we also know that speech reading skills tend to develop with age, and we can see in this slide that in fact if you plot chronological age against speech reading skill, in fact there's quite a positive correlation, because you can see there's speech reading increasing, there's chronological increasing, and you can see there's almost a nice straight line there. So speech reading skills are getting better as children get older. Now, in order to really get a clear idea about the development of speech reading skills, you really need to be able to assess speech reading. And in fact, there is now, for the UK, a standardised assessment for speech reading skills. And I want to introduce you to the TOCS, the Test of Child Speech Reading. In this assessment, children see a video of somebody saying a word, and then they get a choice of pictures and they have to choose the correct one. So here is the example of apple. You can see, unfortunately I can't show you the video clip for various reasons, but the person would be saying apple, then there are 4 pictures and child has to choose the apple, and if they choose apple then they're correct. There's a similar set of assessments that look at sentences. So here, for example, is the baby is in the bath. You see this is a properly designed assessment so that the, as it were, the incorrect answers are also plausible, so the child's got to be quite good at speech reading to get this right. And then there are other more complicated things, so little stories, and then there are various extensions to this test. You can see here, here's just a summary of some of the things that this assessment does. You can, if you're interested in finding out more about this, actually go to the Deafness, Cognition and Language Centre side at University College London, and I've put down there the website, because this test is now available online for people to use with children who are deaf. I think there's an interesting question, of course, what happens when you move to a slightly different variant of language, as would be the case with Australian, because in fact accents do matter. But I think the principles of the test are really interesting, so I do encourage you to look at it. So we then turn to the question of, can speech reading ability actually be developed? Now, I've already hinted at the answer to this question, because effectively, if you rely on speech reading, you tend to become better at it, because speech reading skills develop over time. But interestingly, for the most part, and I say for the most part because not every study has shown this, actually deaf children tend to have better speech reading skills than hearing children. So again, it just suggests if you rely on the speech reading component of spoken language, you'll actually get better at it. The interesting thing, of course, about speech reading, and you'll know far more about this than I do, of course, speech reading information is ambiguous, because various sounds look the same, except for very, very tiny differences that most people can't spot. So here's one of my favourite examples, bear and pear. These are actually 2 of the stimuli I used in my very first test of speech reading. They're very, very difficult to tell apart from the way that people say them. This is why there have been various attempts to support speech reading. I'm going to be talking more about those, in fact, in a subsequent lecture. But effectively, there are different ways in which you can support the information that deaf children get about speech reading so that you disambiguate sounds that look the same. So, for example, you can disambiguate bear and pear so that children can actually tell which one you're saying. So, as I say, I'm going to say more about that in a future lecture. I'm going to talk a bit about cued speech. I'm going to talk about visual phonics. But for now, I just want to pose a more daring question in a way, which is it possible to train speech reading skills? Now, interestingly, if you look at the literature, there's a fairly clear view that you can't train speech reading skills. Now, I think that's perhaps because a lot of the studies have been done with adults. And of course, as I've shown you, there's a lot of evidence that children naturally get better at speech reading if they have to rely on it. And certainly, the older they get, the better speech reading becomes. So that does suggest it is a skill that develops over time. So, since this is a daring thing to do, I've recently been involved in a study in which we have been attempting to train speech reading skills. And this lovely picture is a picture of one of the aliens who is involved in this study, because effectively what it is a game, a whole series of games for children that are based on a computer, and the children use these, we hope, to develop their speech reading skills. In answer to the question, is it possible to train speech reading? Well, unfortunately, I can't tell you the complete answer to this question, but what I can say is the results are looking very promising at the moment, and we are beginning to get in some evidence that, in fact, we can train children's speech reading skills. And so if you want to find out more about this project, then there's the information about it. It's called the STAR project, and as you can see, it's a new computer-based speech reading intervention for deaf children. So I do suggest that you go to the website, and hopefully we will be able to announce the results formally very soon. Just to sum up what I've been saying about speech reading. Speech reading is the visual component of speech, and it's an integral part of perceiving speech. And we can see this by looking at very tiny babies who are born with the ability to integrate auditory and visual information. And we've also seen that auditory and visual information is processed in overlapping regions of the brain. We've also seen that the perception of speech is better when both auditory and visual information is available, and that speech reading skills develop over time, and they tend to be better in deaf children than in hearing children. We will be seeing, so take it as read for the moment, that supplementary information can help disambiguate the very similar lip patterns that appear for particular sounds. Here are some of the references to the research that I've already mentioned, and the article there by Ruth Campbell I think is really good for showing you all the evidence about why speech reading might be important, because actually there are a whole series of studies which unfortunately I don't have time to talk about today. So thank you very much for listening to and watching this particular lecture, and in the next one I'm going to go on and actually have a look at more issues to do with speech reading. So thank you very much for taking part.